Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar this afternoon. Please settle in. We'll begin shortly. Just a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded. If your cameras are not automatically turned off, please turn them off now. And we ask that you also please have your microphones muted. We will turn them back on for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Actually, we will not. Apologies. The chat and Q&A functions should be on. Please be respectful to the presenters and the rest of the audience. Feel free to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're viewing from. If you have any questions for our panelists, please use the question and answer panel or the chat. If you have any issues, please feel free to use the chat or message webinar help directly. You can also email info@cpawsbc.ca. All right, so I guess we'll begin today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making space in your weekday to attend our webinar, Turning the Tide on BC's Coastal Law. My name is Alicia Elgert, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm one of the ocean conservation campaigners at CPAWS-BC. I will be your facilitator this afternoon. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been stewards of the lands and waters encompassing the place colonially known as Vancouver since time immemorial. Throughout the next hour, we'll find out who makes decisions about coastal issues across British Columbia, what laws are in place to protect coastal areas, and how these laws are falling short on conservation. Together, we'll discuss why changes in our laws are vital to the success of the forthcoming BC Coastal Marine Strategy. All right, so at this time, I will pass it over to my colleagues at West Coast Environmental Law to introduce themselves. So I think we'll start with Estella. Estella, if you want to give us a quick introduction.
Class, Chachist, Hashgriat Axops, Conquastakum Axops. Hello, everybody. My name is Estella White. I also carry the name Haitna Chachist. I come from the Hashgriat First Nation, and I belong to the House of Conquastakum. I'm also a lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law, and will be joining today in that capacity. Thank you, Alicia, for having us and organizing this discussion today. I'm happy to be here. True.
Thanks, Estella. Michael, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Bissonnette. I use he, him pronouns. I am a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, where I work primarily on marine law issues. And a couple other things, I'm based in Vancouver, and I was a co-author among a few other folks on a recent publication that's been put out by UBC Press last year called Protecting the Coast and Ocean, which is kind of a textbook to ocean conservation laws in British Columbia. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And we will post the link for that book to access it online if you're interested later on in the webinar. All right. So we've all connected in this space to discuss coastal management across the province and how the presence of a new coastal law or changes to existing coastal laws could strengthen the forthcoming BC Coastal Marine Strategy. CPAWS-BC and West Coast Environmental Law have been advocating for several years for a coastal marine strategy and law that upholds Indigenous rights, preserves biodiversity, and uplifts communities. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Coastal Marine Strategy, I'll give you a quick overview. So right now, the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship is working with participating First Nations to co-develop British Columbia's first coastal marine strategy, which will serve as a comprehensive provincial plan to better protect and manage the coast. We're hopeful that the strategy will be released this summer. In 2022, the Coastal Marine Strategy Policy Intentions Paper was released. The intentions paper proposed 6 outcomes and 30 policy intentions that will inform the coastal marine strategy to come. Based on the contents of this paper, it's clear that the province recognizes the many threats that are facing the coast, including, but of course not limited to, pollution, declining salmon populations, coastal erosion, sea level rise, as well as ocean acidification and hypoxia. Not only do they recognize these threats, but they present themselves as eager to address these interconnected and complicated issues. So this is incredibly encouraging. We're glad that they're ready to take action, but these are some lofty goals ahead of us. In order to change our outcomes, we need to change our behavior and the ways of interacting with the coast. At the end of the day, it comes down to decision-making. As it stands, coastal decision-making across BC is complicated, as there are many jurisdictions that wield power and in many cases overlap. So, Michael, would you be able to provide us with an overview of the different jurisdictions that have a role in coastal decision-making? What are some of the challenges or limitations to the way the system currently functions?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I think that was a good way of setting it up. Coastal management, as you said, in British Columbia, involves right now several different orders of government are involved in managing coastal areas under a number of different laws and different decision makers, and that really. As you said, that was one of the main impetuses for us to see a real need for a coastal marine strategy, something to coordinate decision making on British Columbia, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of outcomes that are getting worse. Things like increasing pollution, loss of habitats that we aren't really organized to address right now, and so. So I'll just give you kind of an overview of the different different orders of government at play, so you can kind of understand that complexity. So first and foremost, you have Indigenous governments who have rights and title, unceded rights and title to coastal marine areas in British Columbia. Some First Nations as well have treaty rights that apply in coastal areas as well. And I don't want to take words from Estella's wise words, because I think she's going to talk about some of this coming up. But Indigenous governments have responsibilities under their own governance structures and their governance and their own laws to steward these areas. And I think we've seen. I don't know if it's fair. I think it's fair to call it like a resurgence of this stewardship in recent years. Especially with things like the Declaration of Indigenous Protected Areas. And again, I think I'll stop talking about that, because I think this is something that Estella's going to talk about. But I think what's important to understand is that these rights are constitutionally entrenched in our Constitution in Canada. And so our provincial and federal governments have responsibilities to protect these rights. And that is part of why we need better coordination, because that coordination is required under the Constitution. So when we talk about Crown governments, so the other governments involved in coastal management, sorry, 1 second. I think often we think about the federal government as kind of being the primary government responsible for coastal management or for ocean spaces when we talk about Crown governments. And there's good reason for that. Under Canada's Constitution, subject to the rights and title of Indigenous nations, the federal government is responsible for some of the kind of most significant activities that happen on the coast, in particular, shipping and navigation, and fishing. And so, decisions about opening and closing fishing grounds, decisions about ports and where ships can discharge pollution, those kinds of decisions are made by the federal government. So very important role for the federal government. But I think through this development of the coastal strategy, one of the reoccurring points that we've been trying to underline and to explain to folks is the provincial government does have quite a lot of jurisdiction under our framework right now to be more proactive and manage coastal areas in a better way. And the province gets a lot of its ability to make decisions, jurisdiction, because it has the Crown title, subject to the rights and title of Indigenous nations, to a lot of seabed areas or kind of submerged areas in British Columbia. So, for example, foreshore area, so the area between the high tide and the low tide. For most of British Columbia, those areas are Crown title is held by the province and not the federal government. It's the same thing for kind of internal bays and fjords. So to give a local example, for example, like the seabed of Howe Sound is an area where the provincial Crown would have the title and not the federal Crown to the seabed. And lastly, I think the other important one to recognize is there was a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada in the 1980s that recognized that the seabed between Vancouver Island and the mainland is held by the provincial government. And so, again, this is subject to the rights and title of Indigenous nations. And by the way, arguably the same analysis would probably apply, but it hasn't been definitively determined in court between Haida Gwaii and the mainland as well. So large areas of the seabed where the province can manage these areas and does so, but it doesn't, but it doesn't really do so in a particularly coordinated way right now. Historically, what we've seen is marine responsibilities have kind of been spread out within the provincial government, and they've kind of administered these responsibilities under statutes or laws that were never really suited for coastal management. So I'll just give you one example in particular, but when they're granting interests in the seabed, so for example, for things like if you want to have a dock on the foreshore, if you wanted to start an aquatic plant operation, if you even the sites of fish farm operations and those kinds of things, they need a Land Act authorization. So they grant an authorization, kind of ironically enough, under the Land Act for those types of things. And the other part, I think the last order, it's not an order of government, but local governments as well have some jurisdiction to manage coastal areas. But that's granted under provincial powers as well. Anyways, I'm hoping I can convey right here with this kind of snapshot is that there's a lot of different decision makers going on, not just between Indigenous nations, federal government, and provincial government, but even within the provincial government. And if we can get kind of a common vision of how we're managing the coast, and if we can get better coordination within the provincial government with a common vision, we're really hopeful that we can also get better coordination and better co-governance with other orders of government as well.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that's a lot of information to take in, folks, but thank you, Mike, for putting that together so well for us. So in campaigning for Coastal Marine Strategy, one of the main goals for CPAWS-BC and West Coast Environmental Law has been to put forward an accompanying coastal law for this strategy. And the good news is that the province has been upfront in acknowledging that the Coastal Marine Strategy could benefit from an accompanying coastal law in order to be effective. So on page 28, actually, of the policy intentions paper, the province identifies that, to quote, in quotations, a key challenge to coastal management is the absence of a legal framework specifically designed to govern and manage coastal marine areas in BC, end of quote. So Mike, coming back to you, could you explain why it's vital that this strategy be accompanied by supportive law or legal framework?
Yeah, absolutely. And Alicia, and to be clear, it's great that the province is acknowledging that there's a need for it and exploring it. But I think one of our goals in the future and going forward is to make sure we get some kind of commitment to law reform. And so that's something that we're definitely watching going forward. And yeah, I'd like to talk about, I think, two high-level things that I think a legal framework or a law can do to benefit the coastal marine strategy. The first one is to hold government accountable. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. But the other thing is to give the government powers that it might not currently have, that it might need to satisfy the strategy. And it might not be necessarily giving those powers also to the province. They might be giving those powers to work better with Indigenous nations, recognize Indigenous governance, or local governments, might be granted powers as well. But on the first point, holding the government accountable, I think that's really an important thing to think about with respect to a strategy like this. So we're going to get a strategy that's going to, or we're hopefully getting a strategy that's going to lay out kind of long-term commitments from the government, objectives, and actions to get us there. So things like restoring habitats and cleaning up our waters and those kinds of things. And that's great. It's very welcome. But the challenge with the strategy is that it isn't legally binding. And so when you have very long-term commitments like this, it's very unlikely that the government who's making the commitments is going to be the government 20 years from now who's going to answer for the commitments. And so if you have a government that decides that, you know what, we don't like this policy that a lot of people have put a lot of time into, including First Nations, including public interest groups around the province, stakeholders, et cetera, a government could turn away from the strategy or choose to ignore it. And it would be difficult to hold them accountable if they did under the law, i.e., it would be difficult to sue them in court for that. But that's not a problem that we haven't experienced before, or that we aren't experiencing in other places. And we do have solutions. For example, when we make climate change policy, it is a situation where we make commitments long into the future. And the government that's making these commitments, we know, is probably not going to be the one that has to answer to them in decades from now. And what we've done on that front is we've introduced Climate Change Accountability Act in British Columbia. And some of the things that does is, first, it legally recognizes some of these climate change goals. So some of these emissions targets that we are seeking to get to. It also creates an independent body to kind of advise on progress on this. And it requires the government to report annually on its progress on this. So you can see how that can be really helpful. I'm not saying we're going to solve climate change on its own just through the Climate Change Accountability Act, but that kind of accountability can be really helpful to make a policy stronger like that. The other thing, so the second aspect of coastal laws that we could really benefit from is there are a lot of powers that the government, or again, local governments, Indigenous nations, might need to carry out the functions in the coastal marine strategy. And so I'll just give you two examples of this, because a policy cannot grant new powers to a government. It needs a legal foundation for that. And so that's why there could be this need. And in this webinar series that CPAWS has been holding, the previous two webinars, the first one was about marine pollution, and the second one was kind of about protecting shoreline areas. And in both of those cases, we had folks talking about the need for more laws to empower the government to address these. So, marine pollution, we have great cleanups that are going on. But cleanups don't stop these things at the roots. We can address plastic coming into our waters, styrofoam leaching into our waters. We can address sewage coming into our waters through laws, and then we can be proactive instead of cleaning these things up. It was the same thing with shoreline areas, where at your last webinar, you had local government folks talking about the need, for example, in Richmond, where there's going to be massive sea level rise. to have support to be able to address these things. And you had folks, I believe you had Jacqueline Bars from WWF talk about the need that we could have a shoreline protection act here in British Columbia, just like they do in Washington State. So those are the kind of things that we think could really benefit the strategy. I think, and especially those are the kinds of things that once the strategy is out, we expect it to have, actions and recommendations, but we're going to need to do this through the implementation phase. And so I think it's going to be really important that we continue to push for these things, and in fact, push harder once we have the strategy out.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate your point about enacting a law is key to getting to the root of the issues rather than kind of like Band-Aid solutions and mitigating actions as we go along. So I appreciate that. It's a great point. So coastal law is not only, or a coastal law is not only vital for the success of the coastal marine strategy, but it also has the potential to integrate well into other provincial conservation plans. Estella, the province is also developing a biodiversity and ecosystem health framework. I want to discuss in a minute how this framework might relate to the coastal marine strategy. But first, would you be able to tell us why or what the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework is, and a little bit about your work that you've been doing on it?
Thanks very much, Alicia. I'm not sure if we are able to share some of the slides. Awesome. Perfect.
Yes, we've got them coming up right for you.
Perfect. I just wanted to start off by saying that my involvement with the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework, as well as the coastal marine strategy, is really informed and shaped by the relationships and the work that I have done with First Nations across BC. And much of that work involves Indigenous-led conservation, and more specifically, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and working with First Nations to advance those initiatives. So when I talk about this framework today, I just want you to bear in mind that it is through that lens and that work and those relationships in which I speak. So we don't have a ton of time to cover some big issues, so I'm hoping to cover some background information on the framework, along with some key commitments that are made in the framework, and finish with some comments on why it matters. So in front of you, you can see on the screen a timeline. And so this is a condensed timeline. It's not the full picture because, as Alicia said and Michael had mentioned, there have been groups of people, First Nations and others, who have been fighting to advance these causes for a long time. But for the purposes of this presentation, the timeline begins in 2020. This is when the provincial government committed to enacting legislation that would prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem health. And this is a commitment that comes out of a recommendation from the Old Growth Strategic Review. And so the province has followed up on that commitment and carried that work forward to, you'll see in the timeline, 2023. So early in that year, BC began to engage with First Nations, local governments, interest groups, and industry to sort of work on creating a draft framework. And that engagement sort of took place over a number of months. And in November of 2023, they released a draft framework, along with sort of an opening to the public, First Nations, anybody who was interested and cared to provide any comments up until January 31st of this year. And I know they received a lot of comments based on recent correspondence. And that sort of brings us to today, right now, spring of 2024, where we are expecting a final framework any day. And so what can we expect from that framework? Well, for one, we can expect that that framework will inform Crown policy and management of land and water in BC. It's also expected to provide strategic direction in the co-development of a new biodiversity and ecosystem health law, as well as amendments to other land and water legislation. And also, it's expected to be implemented and correspond with other provincial processes such as the Coastal Marine Strategy. So it's not just, it's not going to be at odds with those processes that are underway. And that's a little snapshot of some background information. And so the next slide, we get into, well, what is the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework? So the framework is quite extensive. And so what I've done here is I've sort of listed what I consider to be some of the key goals and commitments of the framework. So firstly, it sort of starts with like a broad goal, an overall goal of improving the way that land, water, and ecosystems are managed in BC. And the overarching goal of this framework is really to prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem health and all Crown decision-making. And that includes Crown policies, Crown processes, and legislation that could affect ecosystems, which of course include oceans. And so that's big, that's far-reaching. That's some would say that's all-encompassing. And another key commitment is taking a whole of government approach to ecosystem-based management. And I think that's sort of in recognition that the current siloed approach and the difficulty, the silos even within ministries, let alone across ministries, is totally problematic when we're considering the ecosystem as a whole. So one of the commitments is to take a more holistic and ecosystem-based approach to Crown processes and decision-making, and to do as best as it can to cut across those sectors and ministries and the bureaucracy that happens provincially and beyond. Another commitment, and this is language that comes directly from the framework, is they're hoping to catalyze a transformational shift. And that word transformation is used throughout the framework. And they're hoping to shift from, the current approach now, which prioritizes resource extraction. Most of the legislation that exists prioritizes and enables resource extraction. And they're hoping to use this framework and legislation to create a shift to an approach that prioritizes conservation and management of ecosystem health and biodiversity. So again, another huge goal, a huge commitment. Another commitment is the creation of the Office of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health, which is sort of a body that will be used to help implement the framework and the law once it's in place. And that's sort of like a really important accountability measure and sort of the on-the-ground function of implementing the framework. And lastly, I've listed the commitment to uphold UNDRIP. So that's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the rights therein. And they've committed to co-developing a new biodiversity and ecosystem health law with First Nations. And I will, in the chat, we'll send links to the framework. We'll send links with a relevant blog post with more information, particularly on the framework. So we recognize we can't cover everything today, but that's sort of a sweet little overview of what's in the framework. And next we'll get into, well, why does it matter? So like where I come from, like we have a saying, Hishuk ish sawak, and it means everything is connected, everything is one. And I think that, what we are facing now is we are faced with the reality of things are not working. Things are operating in a dysfunctional manner which have led us to this climate crisis and alarming rates of biodiversity loss. What do we need to do to start to remedy this and to start reversing and, you know, mending these places that we call home and these places that we've relied on since the beginning of time in the case of Indigenous peoples. And so this is really an opportunity to change how things are done. And these commitments are big, you know, and so there'll have to be a lot of work into, because I think that there's the old colonial way of doing things, and it's going to be really hard to to get out of that. So these commitments sound wonderful, but it's going to be a lot of work to actually doing the on the ground work of implementing it and deciding what goes into that new law to actually have those commitments realized on the ground, in the water, all around us. And also it's an opportunity to meaningfully recognize and support Indigenous-led conservation. And I think that, you know, given the work that I do, I've worked with First Nations across BC, and there will be a report that's put in the chat that sort of sets out and it gives an overview of just how successful Indigenous-led conservation is in enhancing ecosystem health and biodiversity. You know, there's growing evidence and growing consensus that shows, you know, that Indigenous laws, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous stewardship, you know, has shown to be more effective than Crown-led conservation approaches. Numerous reports at the local level, international level, you know, have recognized that land and waters managed by Indigenous peoples, they're healthier, with higher rates of biodiversity. So I think that I don't like to be in a position where you have to prove why it's important, you know, because I think that a track record, you know, like like where I come from, we have creation stories that tell of the beginning of time, and they tell stories of when biodiversity was created. And you think about how long ago that was hundreds and thousands of years ago. And when you look at the accounts of when contact was first made along our shorelines all across British Columbia, you know, a lot of the stories you'll hear is, you know, just the abundance, you know, and these thriving legal systems and governance orders of how we related to, and I'm a coastal, like I come up from a coastal nation, and so the word conservation directly ties to the health and well-being of salmon, you know, and so like our whole identities, our languages, our ways of life are just directly tied to the health and well-being of the oceans, of the land, and recognizing Hishuk Ishtawak, that everything is connected. And so I think that this is really an opportunity to center Indigenous-led conservation as a successful, if not the most successful model of taking care of our coastal areas. You know, and the last bullet really touches on, you know, the historical impact that we've been faced with, and we are dealing with the consequences now of how laws and policies have been used to diminish First Nations cultures, laws, governance structures, relationships to the land, like have literally impeded every aspect of our way of life. And this is really an opportunity to change those harmful colonial approaches and to recognize First Nations rights, roles, and responsibilities in taking care of their territories. And this is not a selfish endeavor, you know, like this is a lot of work that is beneficial to everybody. And I think that a lot of the nations that I work with just appreciate the support, you know, and I think that I'm hoping that, you know, this framework and the ensuing law is going to sort of bring those voices to the forefront. And I think that's all I will share at this point. Thanks, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Estella, for sharing all that wonderful knowledge and your thoughts on that. I think you've really done like a really good job in showcasing why co-development and co-management is so important. And really it's a non-negotiable for reconciliation, and it's a non-negotiable for conservation going forward. As you've mentioned, it is like the most effective way to conserve our lands and waters. And we really do need to be looking towards Indigenous people for guidance on this, because the way that we've been functioning as a society colonially, it's not gone well for us. So thank you so much for that. So I have one last question that I'd like to bring forth today. So we've heard a little bit about the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework and why it's important, and what these new laws can do. So Michael, how might the biodiversity ecosystem health framework support the goals of the coastal marine strategy? If you can kind of tie those two strategies and plans together for us, that would be great.
Yeah, and please, Estella, if you want to chime in as well, please do so. Yeah, I think I'll start just by saying a couple just disclaimer here, which is, I think, as Estella has pointed out, these strategies have not been put out yet, and even when they are, there's going to be a lot of work to implement these strategies. So we're really talking about what we've learned so far about these strategies, what they're going to do, and a little bit of what we expect these strategies to do. And so I just want to put that as a disclaimer right now, because as Estella said, nothing has been achieved yet. And so I don't think we can rest on our laurels, as concerned citizens, as Indigenous nation, civil society. There's still a lot of work to be done. But I think some significant things that the biodiversity ecosystem health framework will likely support the coastal marine strategy with is really about this kind of accountability, where I was talking about how laws can hold governments accountable. And I think I mentioned earlier, we haven't gotten a firm commitment from the provincial government to create a new coastal law. They've kind of acknowledged that there's a lack of a proper legal framework right now, and they said they're exploring that issue. But they haven't formally formally pledged that they will, create a law in that respect. It's different in the biodiversity ecosystem health framework, where one of the main actions is to co-develop this law with Indigenous nations. And as Estella kind of mentioned, like the purpose of that law is to kind of put legally kind of bound kind of long-term direction objectives to our management of lands and waters in BC. So in some ways, I think you could probably view the biodiversity ecosystem health framework as kind of like a larger overarching framework of which the coastal marine strategy is kind of a subset or part of. And so it's trying to just do this at a larger scale. But I'm certainly hoping that through the biodiversity ecosystem framework law, that and through some of the accountability measures it's creating, that those are going to make our coastal marine strategy more effective. So having, for example, an Office of Biodiversity that might, just like our climate change advisory board, kind of give us, hey, things are not going well with respect to our biodiversity commitments. We need to do something different. That could be helpful, as could having legislated kind of direction and commitments in law. I'll just give you, I'll just gonna share one more example. But Estella, please, if you have stuff, jump into. But I just want, one of the things that we've often talked about while we were talking about the coastal marine strategy, we were looking at other examples, other places. And there are great examples of this kind of work being done elsewhere. Just one example, in Puget Sound, they have a Puget Sound partnership that kind of coordinates and brings together different governments in the Puget Sound area, the area of Seattle. And they made commitments to rehabilitate, X amount of shellfish beds in Puget Sound. Those are the kind of commitments, those are the kind of things that we should be doing and can do here in British Columbia. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm hoping these two things working together are going to make happen.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a great point about commitments. I know in talking to people about the coastal marine strategy, I know that one of the main pieces of feedback or constructive criticism or maybe worry is that there's so many issues that the province will be trying to tackle. It's got a very wide scope. And there's been a little concern over how the province is going to break down those conservation outcomes into digestible targets, if you will. So really having a legal framework, I think, as you've just mentioned and pointed out, is essential for that. So it just goes to show all the more why that is so essential. Yeah, so we're running a little bit, or we actually are running a little slow, so we have some good extra time ahead of us. I guess, Mike, Estella, if there's anything else you'd like to say, you are welcome to do so now, or we can just move on to our question and answer period and just have a little more time for that today. Okay. So we'll move on. So a sincere thank you to our wonderful panelists, Michael and Estella, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us this afternoon. So we're going to open the floor to some questions from the audience. At this time, if you have a question you would like to submit, please use the chat or the Q&A panel on your screens. So we have a CPAWS-BC staff member working behind the scenes, and they will select a couple of questions at random, and I'll present those to Michael and Estella. While you're typing away, we'll get started with a couple questions that were posed online ahead of time. So Michael, Estella, please feel free, whichever one of you is more comfortable tackling whatever questions are given. There's no assigned order to these questions, so just feel free to jump in whenever you're comfortable, if you're comfortable, and feel free to also just add on some more information as well, because we do have a little extra time here today. So our first question, and I also just wanted to make another mention, is that when you are posing questions, they will be anonymous. So please feel free to put questions in the chat and not have to worry about anonymity. So our first question is, how will the BC Coastal Marine Strategy fit in with the Network Action Plan for the Northern Shelf bioregion? So I think, Mike, this might be a good question for you. Do you also want to maybe explain what is the Northern Shelf bioregion and where that is for people who might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, absolutely. This could be a big, I'll try not to talk too much, but yeah, I think it's important to talk about this. So just for the folks who might not be aware, what Alicia's talking about is a marine protected area network that's being developed in the Northern Shelf bioregion, also kind of sometimes referred to as Great Bear Sea. But perhaps if I don't use any of those, we're talking about the northern coast of British Columbia. So areas from Haida Gwaii to the Alaska border, down to, I think, roughly around Campbell River. And what's happening right now is that there are, I believe it's 17 First Nations who are developing and creating an MPA network with the federal and provincial government. And we're kind of expecting big movements and implementation of this in the years that come. And I think here's what I'd like to say about this. I think northern British Columbia and what's happening there in terms of relationship building and coordination of governance right now is really promising, and I think it's something that is being looked at as models for other places around the world. So just to give you some background, in this area, First Nations developed land use plans. And then they worked with the provincial government and kind of made plans together, or sorry, not land use, but marine use plans in the area under the MAP planning partnership. And so they've been able to kind of build relationships that way, respecting Indigenous rights and Indigenous stewardship of these areas. And now those relationships are kind of deepening, and we're creating an Indigenous-led marine protected area network in the area. It's really exciting. I think it's going to be, I heard it might be the largest Indigenous-led marine protected area network in the world. It also is the first marine protected area network in Canada, so it's quite a groundbreaking project. And I think a lot of the lessons that the province is taking right now, or hoping to take on working better with different governments, and especially with First Nations, are coming from some of these processes. So I think, I don't know, I think the province is very supportive of the Marine Protected Area Network and is committed to it and funded it and mentions it in the Coastal Marine Strategy. And I think it's a tool for conservation. It's an important tool for conservation, for Indigenous food sovereignty, for so many things. But how it's going to factor exactly into the Coastal Marine Strategy, a little bit up in the air.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Mike. So the Coastal Marine Strategy is separate, but BC is a partner in the network. So like the Coastal Marine Strategy is focused on setting a vision and a path for the coastal marine part of the ocean, or the coastal areas of the ocean, including ensuring that important areas are protected and restored. So I think something else is that we're hopeful that the Coastal Marine Strategy will address other impacts affecting the coast, such as like shoreline development as well.
Yeah, and sorry, Alicia, on that point, it's going to bring a lot
of
capacity to the area. So like things like monitoring programs and that stuff, I think are going to be very helpful to the Coastal Marine Strategy.
Totally. Thanks, Mike. Okay, our second question that was posed online for us. How can local efforts to review the state of local marine ecosystems fit into the overall framework of the Coastal Marine Strategy? So Mike, I think this might, again, it's Coastal Marine Strategy related, so it might be in your wheelhouse. Okay,
the question is a little bit ambiguous on what local efforts are, but I'll try to say a few things. Well, first of all, the strategy, I guess, sorry, if we're talking about local governments are very keen to have a Coastal Marine Strategy. In fact, they submitted a resolution to the Union of BC municipalities calling for the need for this, that they needed more support, better coordination for managing shoreline areas in BC, especially with worrisome effects from things like climate change getting bigger and bigger. So local governments are part of this, and I think part of the aim of this is to support local governments. I think this question though might be about local community groups, and I think I think here's one thing I will say about that. We know from experience, and I think there's a lot of folks on this call who probably share these experiences, that it can be very frustrating if you're a local group. Also, if you're an Indigenous nation, this is also a very common frustration, where there's problems going, things aren't going well in your area that you're trying to address, and you're trying to find which government is going to help partner with you to solve these problems. And for a lot of folks in this province, community groups, especially Indigenous nations, they get this kind of runaround where they're told to go speak to this province, to the province, or go speak to the federal government, or go speak to this ministry. And I think that's very frustrating. And it's one of the reasons that we have increasing problems on the coast, is some of these things are falling through the cracks. And so if we had a coordinated government body that was responsive to these things, I think it's going to be a lot easier for local groups. And I think the province has taken steps in this direction. They've created this new Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship that for the first time, we're consolidating marine programs in BC into one ministry. So I think that in itself is helpful, but But I think a lot of folks on this call, I'm kind of noticing from the comments and whatnot, are still finding there's a lot of issues that are kind of falling through the cracks. So that's what we need to address.
Thanks, Mike. I also think from like a community perspective, people living on the coast have that perspective of what is happening in their very localized area and are witnessing firsthand the issues that we're talking about today or have talked about in the past with regard to pollution and like coastal erosion and shoreline armoring and just the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. I could go on for a long time on the list. So it's really important to be getting the stories that are coming from them and things that they're witnessing and experiencing, and above all, Indigenous people who have been seeing these things for generations now, slowly compiling, it's key. And I think also knowing that one of the outcomes of the coastal marine strategy is to really work on monitoring, effective monitoring as well. And if there's a way to mobilize community efforts towards that goal, I think that can only be a good thing. Okay. So we're gonna move on to some questions that you all in attendance have put down in the chat. So these questions are chosen at random based on like what we think will be relevant today and just kind of shuffling them up a little bit. So my first question here is, again, either for Mike or Estella. Do you think that the coastal marine strategy and or the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework will or can support provincial legislation to formally or legally recognize Indigenous protected and conserved areas?
I will step in. I think that the short answer is yes. We have been sort of called upon by at least some First Nations. It is not sort of a consensus amongst all First Nations that this is the way to go, but I know at least with some First Nations that we are doing work with, you know, this direct issue was put, you know, in the comment period when the draft framework was released. We heard from a number of nations that, you know, if you look at the framework now, IPCAs are not mentioned in the entire framework. Indigenous guardians are, which is amazing and awesome, and that's great. But I think that during that comment period, you know, Wallace and the provincial government heard from a lot of First Nations on why, like why IPCA is not recognized, and hoping that there would be some level of recognition, and again, it all goes into sort of the process and, you know, and that goes back to co-development and what does that look like. And I think that a lot of First Nations are open to that idea, because I think in many cases of self-declared Indigenous protected and conserved areas is that Crowns are still making decisions with respect to those territories. And with some level of provincial recognition and protection, it would better serve some of the purposes of the IPCA, particularly around conservation. So I think that I cannot speak for all First Nations, but I know some First Nations are advancing that strategy. Is it enough to say that should we start lobbying? I think that I would say, I don't know if a consensus has been reached, but I think we will see once the final framework is released. I think IPCAs will be referenced in some fashion, and it'll be about that whole co-development process and how do we implement the framework when you really kind of get to see, okay, like what does that mean, you know, like when we talk about recognition. So we can get into more detail on that, but I think that's sort of the short answer. And please follow up with me more if you want to chat more about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Estella. So I think we have time for one more question if we're going to be quick about it. Okay, so this is again directed either for Michael or Estella. In your personal opinion, what type of legislation would be most effective within the coastal marine strategy? And how could it be used to support coastal marine strategy policy outcomes?
Yeah, so I think there's wishful thinking of like what we would in a perfect world want and what we're kind of expecting right now. In terms of the coastal marine strategy, I think it's fair to expect that what we're going to see in the strategy, the province from the beginning has kind of said the strategy is not going to be legislated at this point. So they're not going to create that kind of overarching coastal marine strategy law at this point to direct this. Although, as we mentioned, biodiversity ecosystem health framework, there is a commitment there to co-develop a law with Indigenous nations that might provide that kind of overarching thing. I think what we're going to find is on specific issues, they're going to have very specific direct actions on changes to laws and new laws that might be needed to address issues. So, for example, if we need more laws to protect nearshore areas, to protect the really important habitats there, to prepare communities from sea level rise, to direct development in these areas. Those are the kind of things that we're probably going to see a recommendation for changes to laws in the coastal marine strategy. Ideally, I think in a perfect world, we'd love to see an overarching coastal law for British Columbia. I just don't know if the political winds are there yet.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so it's 12:57. We have 3 minutes left. So with that, I'm gonna roll us into a wrap up, but don't sign off yet. We have a couple interesting links for you folks and a bit of a take action ask. So before we get on with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. We had a lot of comments and questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them today, but thank you so much for your participation and engagement with the conversation today. So for our action today, so the introduction of a coastal law is not an easy task. So right now we're trying to collect postcards to send to Nathan Cullen, Minister of Water, Lands and Resource Stewardship, in order to demonstrate our support for the coastal marine strategy and to amplify any asks that we have within that strategy. So a link should appear in the chat. So please use the link entered to head on over to our Blueprint for the Coast website and demonstrate your support for a coastal law. Perhaps share something that you learned from our conversation today. Lastly, if you're keen to continue learning about coastal law and protection, you can view Protecting the Coast and Ocean, a guide to marine conservation law in British Columbia, written by some of our friends at West Coast Environmental Law, including Michael. So if you are keen to give that a look, I highly recommend it. Head on over to that link. So thank you once again, everyone, for spending your lunch hour with us this afternoon. We're so grateful that you made it out today. Lastly, a friendly reminder that everyone registered for the webinar today will receive an email link to the recording of this conversation once that's ready. And thank you again to Estella and Michael for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us today. With that, I'll sign off and say goodbye, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.